How did you develop an interest or a passion for your field of study?
It's a long story, actually. I didn't know that this is what I wanted to do at first. I mean, as a kid, I always loved science and scientific ways of understanding things, but then I also really loved languages, and I loved people and cultures. I traveled a lot, and I lived abroad, and Kenya and Russia and all these places. But I never really knew when I started college that when you're interested in languages and how they shape the mind and sociality and things like that, from a scientific perspective, that you should actually study psychology. I just didn't know that when I was 17 years old and I went to college. So I started doing what made sense to me, which was to learn languages. And so I tried to, I was interested to kind of watch myself learn to read over again. So I learned Russian. And I was really interested to learn a language that would sound totally unfamiliar to me, so that I could just see what that felt like, to kind of be a baby again and learn language from the start. And so I learned Kiswahili, and I went and lived in Kenya. And then I majored in French literature, actually, because I was really interested in kind of, literature and language and foreign cultures. And then from there, I also took a lot of science at the same time. So I was taking like a year of every science as kind of distributions because I enjoyed it. So I did a year of physics and a year of astronomy and a year of biology and a year of physical anthropology and whatever. And then I stumbled into a course on developmental psychology, and it was psychology of infancy. So it was basically a course on how we study what babies know, what babies understand, what they can do. And it was taught by a woman named Liz Belke, who's just a fabulous infant psychologist. And I was totally hooked. And so I realized that my love of languages and my love of scientific study of development really should come together somehow. But I wasn't sure how. So I kind of messed around with anthropology, and I did different things, but nothing really felt quite right to me. And traditional kinds of psychological study, like a doctoral program in psychology from an experimental standpoint, where you kind of manipulate people, didn't really appeal. Somehow I was more interested in being in with real people and trying to understand, it's kind of a real world applicable problem. And so it's a long story, but since you asked, I'll tell you. I started working in a completely different field, building things out of wood, because I really loved working with woodworking cultures and all this kind of stuff. And I ended up cutting my hand at a job site, and I had to take some time off, and I didn't know what I was going to do to support myself. I was 23 years old. And so I realized, I have a big, broad science background. I should just get science teacher certification, quick, and teach so that I could, support myself for a bit. I knew I would hate it. I knew school was never really actually the place I loved to be. I never wanted to be a teacher or to be involved with education once I got done myself, to be honest. And then I got into a very sort of urban, highly diverse school district in the Boston area. It turns out to be the second most diverse district in the state and in New England. It had many different kinds of kids, many different kinds of languages, all kinds of stuff. And I was teaching 7th grade science to these first generation kids from just all over the world, mixed up together in there. And I had no idea how fascinating that could be, and I finally realized very quickly that that education was a place where I could truly bring together my my love of developmental psychology with my love of culture and sociality and languages, and actually study those from a scientific perspective, but that was really sort of embedded in a societally relevant question rather than a kind of esoteric kind of ivory tower question. And so I decided to go back to grad school in education. I've been doing a bunch of night school and stuff to try to ready myself for that, because I didn't have the background credentials to get into an education school. And I started doing my master's at Harvard in education in cognitive development, and immediately realized that this was just, I couldn't do this in a year. I really needed like a lifetime, and maybe more than one lifetime, to do what I wanted to do here. So I dove into that, and I moved into a doctoral capacity at Harvard, and I started working on my doctorate and studying sociality and emotionality and cognitive development, and trying to look at how these things come together in cultural frameworks and schools and things. And it was totally fascinating to me, but I realized also as I was learning these things that the ways in which we were making meaning using our mainly sort of anthropologically derived tools in education, right, for qualitative interviewing and for these kinds of meaning making and for observational learning in research, were fantastic ways to observe behavior and the ways that people were interacting and learning. But the theories that we were building to undergird and explain the patterns of behavior seemed to me to be it was hard to know how valid those theories were from a biological perspective. I mean, it seemed to me that if I could learn something about social and affective neuroscience, and how the brain learns and what we know about brain functioning, I could sort of make a kind of a Venn diagram out of my interests and think, well, we were observing that these things are what happens in the real world, and we think that the mechanism might be this, but then some mechanisms might be sort of biologically more plausible than other mechanisms. And so if we could intersect those two ways of thinking in terms of biological plausibility of the mechanisms and psychological reality of us observing, behaviors that look like they reflect these mechanisms, we would have a better chance in that middle ground of actually building theories with real-world validity that had real buying power in education. And so I started to study neuroscience as an education doctoral student. So I kind of went outside the School of Education at Harvard and I took classes in neuroscience, around the university and around other universities in Boston. And I found that really, really helpful and useful, and I actually framed my dissertation research around using neuroscience to inform the study, the qualitative and quantitative psychological study of two young men who had each suffered the removal of an entire brain hemisphere. One his left brain hemisphere, one his right brain hemisphere, was surgically removed to cure intractable epilepsy. And these kids both had actually compensated for this surgery to really unforeseen levels. They just did remarkably well considering the fact that they had half of their brain. And so I set out to study them using what we know about what the different hemispheres do and contribute to certain skills, and then trying to figure out, well, how are they doing what they shouldn't be able to do, given they're missing the brain that does this, right? And try to use that to sort of figure out something about the way in which plasticity happens in the brain, the way in which individual learners with different kinds of strengths and propensities, approach problems that they maybe are not naturally inclined toward. I mean, here we can say unequivocally that this guy is a right-brained learner. He's probably one of the only ones. He's one of the very few on the whole planet, because he really only has a right hemisphere. And so how do we know what he's doing? How is he doing things that the left hemisphere should normally do? So I started to study that. But the more deeply I delved into kind of the social and affective aspects of that processing neurobiologically, the more I came up against another kind of roadblock that I hadn't foreseen, which is really very little, remarkably little, was known about how the brain processed social stimuli and affective stimuli.
Field.
So it really was a new field in neuroscience too. So I feel like I was kind of following a question by that point. And I wanted to learn more about this, but I realized if I really wanted to understand complex social emotions and how they're neurobiologically processed, emotions like compassion or like inspiration or admiration for virtue, these kinds of emotions that really, at a complex, developed way, really drive the way people interact with one another and the values behind, whole career choices and things like that. I was going to need to, basically innovate in neuroscience too and find, design methods to study these. And I was incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity when I graduated with my doctorate to pursue a postdoc with Antonio and Hannah Damasio at the University of Southern California. I went out to work with Antonio and did a 2.5-year really intensive study of affective neuroscience with him, where I really learned what we know, what we knew so far about how the brain supports emotion and emotional feelings and experience of self, and then innovated and sort of moved forward with that. And now the research that I do brings together my sort of love of and interest in educational settings and developmental, real societally relevant questions around how we support learning and growth in meaningful meaningful ways that are going to facilitate kids growing into, you know, the kind of moral, self-sufficient, critical thinkers that we aim for in the world. At the one hand, and then I also am studying social and affective neuroscientific questions and using what we're learning to try to inform the study of development, and also using what we're learning developmentally to try to inform the kinds of questions that we look at in the neuroscience studies. So
what
it's a long answer.
What types of methodology do you use?
Yeah, so what I actually settled on, one of the methods that seems to work really well for us and has been very productive, it's not the only thing we do, but it's a major way, basically involves combining, and this really hadn't been done before in neuroscience, but combining qualitative interviews of the sort that I learned to do in a human developmental program together with neuroimaging and psychophysiological recording. So what we do, like the basic shell of the experiment is we bring a person to the lab. It's incredibly labor intensive, but it works very, very well. So we bring someone to the lab. We first do a bunch of background, baseline recording of psychophysiological things like how their heart beats and gets perturbed by cold water dripping on their hand and stuff like that, to get a sense of how sort of biologically reactive someone is naturally. And then we bring them into a 2-hour interview where they sit with me or one of my graduate students now and a postdoc, and they hear about a whole series of true stories about real people's lives that we've compiled from all over the world. Depending on the experiment, the people might be from different places or different kinds of stories. But they're all true stories with no actors or anything like that. So it's very, very compelling. It's almost like little documentaries that we expose them to. And we talk through the story with the person. And we found that doing it this way results in much more genuine and much stronger and more reflective emotions in the participant than just, watching somebody, watching a video by yourself or just reading a little vignette. But here the person really has a chance to engage with another person's story and to really react to it in a natural way. We don't tell people what emotions we're studying. We don't ask them to choose off a list how they feel or anything like that. We just ask them an open-ended question, which is, how does this person's story make you feel? And then we're videotaping those interviews. So then later we can go back and we can study all kinds of things about that interview, the way the person behaves, the way they engage the experimenter's attention, their own eye gaze and attentional processing, their sort of embodied sensations that they describe, the words that they use to describe their feelings, the complexity of the cognition that they bring to understanding the stories, the way in which they connect to personal memories, just any number of things. Their body posture, their body language, their facial expressions, their reactivity and expressiveness, and any number of things. And we've done this now in different cultural groups. We've done it in China, and then what we do is we take the neuroimaging data, we move the person into the scanner, and we show them again short clips from the same stories that depict kind of the crux of the story that they had just reacted to in a private interview, and we show it to them again in the scanner while we're recording, ECG, which is heart rate, and respiration, and GSR, which is, microscopic sweating on the bottoms of their feet that are a measure of sort of endogenous autonomic arousal, which is a component of emotion. And then we show them the stories again, and we give them a long gray screen after each one, and we ask them to report to us by pushing buttons how they feel about each story, then and there in real time, like what they're thinking about and how they feel and how strongly they feel. And then we take them back out of the scanner and we interview them again, so we make sure we understand what their button presses meant to them, what they meant when they pushed different fingers, so we know we can interpret their real experience. And then what we basically do to analyze the data is we look at patterns of correspondence between brain activity in certain regions we're very interested in, between brain activity and psychophysiological patterns of reaction, as those come together to correlate with a person's reported experience. So in other words, we're trying to understand how brain and body packages of behaviors and physiological changes are interpreted or experienced by the participant as a particular emotion state. And then we look at individual and cultural variability in how those patterns of behaviors and brain activity correspond to experiences. And what we find, for example, is that different cultural groups might have the same magnitude of brain response, the same magnitude of feeling, but the way in which the brain response corresponds in real time to the feeling is actually shaped by their culture. And we can actually predict certain aspects of these correspondence patterns based on individual variability in the way people describe their emotions in the interview, or in the way they behave in the interview. So or different kinds of tension they show and things like that. So we actually use the natural behavior that's elicited in the interview as a way to index and measure variability in how real people experience and build emotion states and feelings of their emotions, and then we correspond those to patterns of biological change when people say they feel a particular way, and then we look at how cultural and individual differences shape the way people experience their own emotions. That's the basic, yeah.
Are there implications then for pedagogy?
Oh, certainly. I mean, not directly, right? So, and I've said this a lot, but not today, but I say this all the time, and that is that, neuroscience is a discipline that teaches us about the biological systems for learning and for sociality and for emotionality and for basic functions that undergird learning, that are brought together during the learning process. But understanding how those systems work does not translate directly into pedagogical interventions. There's another level of work that has to happen there, where we need to actually think about the educational context you're interested in, think about the cultural context, think about the development of those learners and the situation, and then we need to derive principles of learning from the brain studies that we can then apply and translate into these contexts. And that in itself is a big, effortful, time-consuming, and difficult step. That is almost its own specialty right there. So we can't tell teachers what to do at all, but what we can do is provide basic information about what learning looks like and what it actually involves, and then they can, knowing that, work to try to infuse that information into their curricular design so that their pedagogy supports learning more directly and more effectively.
What new areas of research are you interested in exploring?
Yeah, so I think the areas that I'm most passionate about right now have especially to do with culture. I'm really, really interested in how culture and cultural exposure to ideals and norms and values around emotionality, around sociality, and around self shape potentially the ways that biological systems for arousal and consciousness and memory and emotion processing are organized through development, and the ways that individual biological propensities toward biological reactivity. Some people are just sort of more arousable than others. Some people are super empathic. Some people are kind of naturally calmer, that kind of thing. How those natural proclivities are actually then interacting with and shaping acculturation. Because basically, culture to me is fundamentally a developmental question. Culture is a window into the role of values and norms and social interactions and relationships, and how those together are influencing and organizing child development. So by looking at cultural effects, we can actually have a window into looking at the role of social relationships and values on development. So that's something that I'm very, very intrigued with right now.
Mary Helen, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks.